I can pretend to be a European bureaucrat in Brussels. How does European policy on Iran look like and why? And certainly where I live in Washington, D.C., the issue of Iran is a top foreign policy issue. And as we enter the 2024 American presidential elections, you can expect the issue of Iran to come up. I expect the man who won big in Iowa last night, former President Donald Trump, he will be speaking a lot about Iran and how he will deal with the Ayatollahs once he's back in the White House. If there is time today, I'd like to talk about how also I do not see in an American policy on Iran that to me is serious, that is long-term, that is strategic. If there is time, we'll get to that. But I will start off by just introducing you to this book that came out just over 2 years ago. Now, you have to remember this. I never did a PhD. I finished that master's and I went in and I started. The last 25 years I've been an analyst in London, in Washington, covering different parts of the world. But my language skills took me eventually to Iran. So I spent every day getting up and reading for hours what's going on in Iran and the Middle East. And then I spend the afternoon either writing or figuring out what's going on in Washington, D.C. Remember, there are about 50,000 American military personnel in the Middle East. From Syria to Egypt to Oman to Turkey, all the Gulf states. The Middle East matters for the United States. So what happens in the Middle East does matter. And for that reason, people like me, non-academics, Iran watchers, we're trying to bring these two together. What's happening? Why does it matter for America? Or for the West, for that sake. And this book, I wrote this book to tell a story. So I was born in 1975, 4 years before these men, the Ayatollahs, took over Iran and finished 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. I was too young to be involved in the revolution, so you can't blame me what happened. I had nothing to do with it. But I did live the first 5 or 6 years of my life under these gentlemen. And I can tell you from a personal experience that the Iran of my parents before 79 and the Iran of people like me is a very different Iran. And that's what I want to talk to. If you're interested in your Q&A, I'd love to tell you more about what I think is happening domestically. But most of my remarks will be focused on foreign policy. But as I said, if you are interested in what's happening inside this country, which we shouldn't forget, it's 3 times the size of France, it's 85 million people, it's 5,000 years of history. It's a pretty complicated place. But if you're interested, please do ask questions, and I'd love to answer in a way that I can. Let me start, because we only have 45 minutes. Let me start at the time of the revolution. And you see here, I say, to understand today's Iran, you have to start at what happened in 1979. You know, from 1941 to 79, Iran is America's biggest friend in the Middle East. Iran develops massively. If you talk to Iranians, they will tell you that the Iranians born in the 1920s and 30s and the ones born in the 50s, they lived very different lives. Iran's oil income really made a difference. The leader in this picture, you see the Shah, who was there from 41 to 79. He was, and so was his father, Reza Khan, 20 years before he ruled. These two men, whether you like him or dislike him, they did develop Iran economically in ways that nobody can deny. If you go to Iran today, if you get on a train, if you go to certain parts of the country, you see infrastructure. It was either his father or many times, not always, his father or himself. But the problem was not everybody benefited. Not everybody benefited under the Shah. And that increasingly became a problem for him by the time he was toppled in the late 70s. In terms of foreign policy, the Shah was undeniably anti-communist. The United States had some of its biggest surveillance equipment on the Soviet borders in northern Iran, watching what the Soviets were doing. So the Shah was in the Western camp. He pursued policies that were Western, essentially. He made Iran become a member of CENTO, which is the equivalent of NATO in the Middle East. But I would argue, and again, some of you in the room might have questions about that, most of those policies that were pro-Western were not in conflict with Iranian interests, Iranian national interests. I can give you examples. The Shah was an actor in the Arab-Israeli conflict. He intervened in Yemen on the behalf of the anti-communist forces in the 60s. He intervened in Oman against the communist insurgency in the 70s. He had policies in Lebanon. He intervened in the Pakistani civil war in the 70s, and so on and so on. But at no point did he take steps that risked Iranian national interest, in my view. In my view. Again, I say this, repeat this in my view, because so much of what I'm saying is a perspective. And you can equally critique or push back on some of these judgments. But my point is, he followed a cautious foreign policy. He followed a cautious foreign policy that was essentially rooted in the Western world. Now, did the United States humiliate the Shah? You know, I have come across over the years and spoken to former American diplomats and ambassadors who tell me we could have been nicer to the Shah than we were. We took him for granted. And I think that's something one can debate. And the man certainly had big insecurities in terms of his position vis-a-vis the West. We don't have time today to go into the fall of the Shah in '79. But there's one lesson that I think is relevant for our conversation today as we look forward. And here's the lesson. The Shah of Iran was pro-Western, but also believed essentially that the West could remove him. So when ambassadors from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from France, from Germany, they told him, maybe you should go in '79. He listens to them, and he went. I want you to contrast that to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader today. If the West told him to do certain things, he doesn't listen to the West. So what you have here in terms of personalities is somebody who felt he owed the West, or he couldn't say no to the West, versus somebody who's today's supreme leader, who essentially doesn't have any reservations in saying no to the West. A couple of other points, and then I'll move on to the next slide. You also have to understand the personality of the Shah. He was educated in Switzerland, in a boarding school. Most of his cabinet, if you look at who worked in the Shah's government, most of them were educated in France, in Germany, in the United States, in the United Kingdom. This was a very Western-looking group of elite that wanted to turn Iran into a European country, even though Iran is not in Europe, it's in the Middle East. But their mindset was that no, we can make it. We can make this journey and join Europe. And quietly in that Iranian society, in the 50s, in the 60s, and the 70s, what you have is anger building up in the traditional classes, the religious-minded people, the working class, who said, we're not Germans, we're not English, we're not French, we're Iranians, this is our country, this is our religion, and this king over here is not respecting it. And therefore, you have the beginning of the opposition to the Shah, which is a combination of different political interest groups coming together. And with his fall in 1979, this country of Iran had to choose the trajectory of its future. And that's when you have Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini enter the stage. I chose this photo, by the way, because Henry Kissinger recently died at the age of 100. And he was a very close friend. So was his boss, President Richard Nixon. They were big believers in Iran, the United States having close relations. And someone like Kissinger, to the very last day of his life, if you had asked him, his complaint about the Ayatollahs in Iran was this: I wish they would just act like a nation state and stop acting like a revolution. If they act like a nation state, United States and Iran have so much in common. There's so much they can do together. But if the Iranian regime continues to want to be Islamist revolutionary, then there will be conflict between the two. So let's go over and have a look at this gentleman, Ayatollah Khomeini, who Again, we don't have time to go into his life story, but he advertised himself as a proud Muslim and Iranian nationalist. He called the Americans, the West in general, European and Israel, godless imperialists that put economic development above spiritual pursuits in life. He was somebody that was easy to romanticize, and his message. Many on the left did so, even in Europe. I deliberately put that photo underneath Khomeini there. You see that photo is from 1967. It's either taken in Bonn, the former capital of Germany, or Berlin. This is when the Shah visited Germany in 67. And guess who is next to the Shah? President Lyndon Johnson of the United States. The Shah had become a figure to be hated by not just the left in Iran, by the left internationally, by the left in Europe. He was this pro-American servant of imperialism. So this was a hugely damaging place for the Shah to be, because in the 60s and 70s, you see the combination of the Islamist, what we call today, the Khomeini supporters of today, the Islamists, and the socialists and the communists. They become one, essentially, in opposing the Shah. And this coalition turns out to be too much for the Shah to conquer, to defeat. And as you know, by 79, the Shah has to leave the country. Again, what we're talking about, where is Iran today? We have to ask the question, so what did these people who were against the Shah in the 60s and 70s, what did they stand for? What was it that they wanted? What was their agenda? And here's the most interesting part. There was no one agenda. The left didn't have anything in common with Khomeini. The left didn't believe in religion. Khomeini was all about religion. The only thing that kept them together was the anti-Shah sentiment. And once the Shah was gone, these people started fighting each other. So who did Ayatollah Khomeini start putting in prison first? The communist members of the Tudeh party in 80, 81. And by the 82, Tudeh party is being banned. He picked conflicts, and I mention these because the decisions that man made in 79, in 80, 81, those early years of the revolution, we are still living with the consequences of those decisions almost half a century later. He chose a fight with the United States. Again, you remember the hostage-taking situation when Iranian supporters of Khomeini took over the American embassy in November of 1979. A hugely important moment in American history. I teach for a lot of U.S. military officers. A lot of them are in my age group, 40s and 50s. And when you mention Iran in 79, the first thing that they remember as children was that they took our diplomats hostage. It shaped the worldview of a generation of Americans. Iran used to be a place that Americans loved to go and visit and live and work in. 50,000 Americans used to live in Iran before 79. And then suddenly overnight, America becomes the big enemy of the Iranian regime. And for the American public, Iran becomes this country of exporting terrorism, radicalism, and all the bad things that we know. So these are all decisions that this gentleman here, Ayatollah Khomeini, makes. Again, this is somewhat controversial. If I said this in Tehran, they would probably arrest me for this one statement. But I believe he provoked a war with Saddam Hussein. We know Saddam Hussein attacked Iran, but he provoked Saddam Hussein to attack Iran, I think. He provoked foreign policies, including his position on Israel, which is something that we see to this day. So essentially, you have Khomeini making decisions in domestic, foreign, economic, and cultural that really divide the Iranian society. We were just talking about it over lunch before. You can go on a flight today to Tehran, and you can have the same conversation with two different Iranians, and you would think they come from two different planets. This is the split in Iranian society. And a lot of it to do with the decisions of the religious men like him, who put off the non-religious communities and ostracized them. And by the way, again, I'm not an academic. You might have a better answer for this, but you could make the argument that the changes that Khomeini brought to Iran in 79 makes the Iranian Revolution of 79 the last real revolution in history, at least so far. right? It was the last time you had a political order entirely replaced by a new order without an external attack, without a coup, but a revolution from streets, and they brought the king and his military down. Before I move on to the two focus of my book, Khamenei and Rafsanjani, let me just remind everyone that 79 to 89 is a very dark period in Iranian history in the 80s. Right? When you were here, maybe in Poland, again, you have to maybe forgive me for my lack of knowledge about Polish history, but I think Solidarity movement was alive in the 80s in this country. Am I right? Maybe there was hope. This is the opposite of what's happening in Iran. It's darkness. They went from being a country whose passport was respected. You could get on a flight with an Iranian passport without a visa, go anywhere, to an Iran that was suddenly ostracized and, kept out by the international community. You had the Iran-Iraq war, 250,000 people dead, political repression, and immigration. Large immigration starts. Iranians don't have a history of emigrating. We're not like the Germans or the Irish, or, we don't emigrate. We tend to go and study and go home. But this changes in 79. So today you have 5-6 million Iranians from New Zealand to Argentina, from New York to London. Large community, the diaspora. And they're important. I mention them for a reason. If they get themselves organized, they could really shape events inside of Iran. Because that's how influential they are. That's how, in terms of money, financial resources, connections. I mean, did you notice 2022, I think it was in Berlin, just a few kilometers from here, that they had 80,000 protesters in Berlin.
That was the biggest one.
Biggest one. So, my point is, some of these people who Khomeini's policies forced out of Iran, they're themselves, maybe their children will go back eventually, maybe one day, to see if they can get back the country that was taken away from them. But anyway, my point about this slide is the stage is set. Khomeini sets the stage for where we are today. The guy who takes over from Khomeini is Ayatollah Khamenei. And Ayatollah Khamenei learned some key lessons from Khomeini, which I will then speak about now. But before I do that, 3 big red lines of Khomeini that Khamenei adopted, and to this day continues to defend. One was their policies against women. That picture you see there of Iranian women protesting against the hijab, the veil, that's from March of 1979, 1 month after Khomeini returns from Paris. The first big political protest in Iran is not the communists, it's not some, anybody else, women, ordinary women in Iran in the streets saying no to forced hijab. And to this day, again, 45 years later, the regime has made this into a pillar of their policy. Because if they compromise on this, the regime fears they have to compromise on everything else. So therefore, in a society that is a secular society, Iranian society today is a secular society by and large. There are religious pockets, but most Iranians are secular. A smart regime would say, why am I fighting half of my population, all the women? Why am I forcing them to wear something they don't want to wear? It's a political calculation. If they say yes to these women, they have to say yes to all sorts of other demands. The other 2 issues that are red lines for the regime, their position on Israel. You see that? That's the El Al, the Israeli airliners' offices in Tehran. This is 78 sometime, being bombed by leftists or Islamists who looked at Israel and continue to look at Israel as a colonial American project. So that's target number 1 in terms of foreign policy. And number 2 is obviously the taking over the American embassy in 79. And to this day, there is no American embassy in Tehran, and there is no Iranian embassy. There is an Iranian embassy, but it's shut down in Washington. These are some of the key legacies of Khamenei that this Iranian supreme leader today, Khomeini, that Khamenei, the supreme leader today, to this day hangs on to. By the way, I have to apologize for a second. Khomeini and Khamenei can be a bit confusing, even for Persian speakers. Yeah. But there's 2 different men, as you know, very different. One came from 79 to 89, the other one 89 to this day. Okay, so let me move on. So the Khomeinists, and you see the two characters in my book, the Khomeinists are together in the 80s. They fight the left, they fight all their opponents. When they're done fighting everybody else, they have nobody to fight but among themselves. So you have from 89 onwards, inside this Iranian regime, factions appearing, so-called moderates, became moderates and reformists, and then what we call the hardliners today. They had different ideas about where Iran should go. Some of them wanted to focus on economic development. Others wanted to focus on staying revolutionary. You see the two men in the middle, the guy with the white turban, that's Rafsanjani, and the guy with the black turban and a cane, that's Khamenei. So Rafsanjani was the more powerful figure throughout the 80s. Again, we don't have time for me to get into it, but Rafsanjani makes a big miscalculation. He thinks he can turn Khamenei into a religious leader, a symbolic religious leader, and he can then run the country as he wishes. That was Rafsanjani's great plan. Obviously, that didn't happen. This book of mine, I traced their rivalry, I traced their friendship and rivalry going back to the 50s. And I kind of conclude, I showed many different cases of where they had disagreements on policy, but fundamentally, in summary, one of the two men, Rafsanjani, believed in creating popular legitimacy for the regime. You needed to create jobs. You needed to make economic conditions better. You needed to do that. You needed to have better relations with the United States, right? I mean, imagine you're sitting in Tehran, it's 1991, the Soviet Union just collapsed, and you need to fix your economy because you just had 8 years of war with the Iraqis. Your economy is devastated. You look around, who is the big superpower that nobody can deny? It's called the United States of America. Rafsanjani says, you know what? That's a fact. You can't deny it. You have to talk to the Americans, whether you like it or not. The other guy, Khamenei, who by this point has become supreme leader, he's not so sure. He has doubts about the Americans. These doubts over the years deepened. And essentially, he doesn't believe in the need to go out there and make people like you. He said they don't need to like you, they need to fear you. And that's how you stay in power. And that's why Khamenei has spent the last, whatever it is now, since 89, to build security services, military capabilities. You've seen the missiles, the nuclear program, both domestically and in terms of external affairs. They're aimed at gaining respect through fear, power projection. He doesn't care about the economy. Khamenei knows that Iran could be a top 20 global economy if the Iranians actually acted policies to cultivate their oil, their gas, their massive market, minerals, tourism potential, agricultural potential. They could. But Khamenei has never focused on economic development. He has never focused on economic development. And I think that's still, as I say, that bullet point, I still think that is the case. 2017, Rafsanjani dies, and the regime loses one important wing. There is no counterbalance to Khamenei anymore. There is no counterbalance. Rafsanjani is gone. And by the way, again, we talked about this briefly, if we don't know how Rafsanjani died to this day. His family claimed that he was assassinated, killed while he was swimming in a pool.
Don't go to the swimming pool.
We don't go to that swimming pool. Long story, but my point is, this is a very Machiavellian story here. The man who made him the supreme leader might have been at the end assassinated by the same man. Khamenei is 84 today, and today there's nobody who can challenge him. And he's now thinking, who's going to come after me? Who's going to succeed me? How do I preserve my legacy? Because he wants the country to remain revolutionary, to remain anti-American, anti-Western, and he wants to go towards Russia and China because he says that's the future. The West is declining. America is declining. Europe is declining. That's not the future. The future is the East. The future is Russia. Don't ask me how, but that's how Khamenei believes the world is going. So, Just very quickly wrapping up, he had three, put this Iranian president of today, Ebrahim Raisi, aside. There have been three presidents basically since '89. First one was Mohammad Khatami. Then you had Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and then you had Rouhani. Again, without getting into too much domestic politics, each of these presidents tried to pursue foreign policies that they felt would better serve Iranian national interest, which included picking up the phone and calling Washington saying, "Good morning, maybe we should have coffee, maybe we should talk, maybe we should see if we can reduce tensions." And guess what? Each time one of these three gentlemen here, Khatami, Ahmadinejad, and Rouhani, each time they tried to do it, that man you see on the top, on the right, the supreme leader, God's man on earth, he said no. Nobody talks to the Americans over my head. That's one of his red lines. You remember I showed you the three red lines? Israel, America, and the women's row. Khamenei does not let anybody touch any of those issues. They are systematically important for the regime. If you compromise on those, you're compromising on his powers and his position. That's why he stopped everyone. So, oftentimes people say, well, there's a new president in Iran. Why doesn't the president, change policy? And then you have to say, the president doesn't have that kind of power. The president has certain powers, so does his ministers. But when it comes to the red lines of the regime, supreme leader, his office will not allow any major changes to happen unless they say so, unless they want it to happen. How are we doing with time? 10 more minutes. I think we can make it. So, what did Khamenei do? Khamenei created, he didn't create. He empowered the Revolutionary Guards. These are the generals that you read about today. These are the generals who are helping the Houthis with the drones and the missiles in the Red Sea. These are the ones in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, who helped Hamas. The Revolutionary Guards is a state within a state. It has its own intelligence service, it has its own military branch, it has media, economic power. It is essentially a state within a state. And it only answers to one individual, that guy over there, Khamenei. So what I said before, power. It's about power. And Khamenei, if Khamenei could have his way, he would get rid of the Iranian presidents, these cabinets, the parliament. This is, for him, just a waste of time. Why not just stick with the Revolutionary Guards? They can do anything he wants them to do. But Khamenei can't do that because, again, the revolution of 1979 was about creating a republic. So for the sake of having this show, they have to have this presidency and parliament and so on. But we all know where real power is. Real power is with these gentlemen in the Revolutionary Guards today. They suppress the domestic opposition at home, and from a Western point of view, which very concerns Washington, London, and so on, is that these are the guys who are running the so-called proxy model, the network in the region. So, let me just very quickly talk about the challenge of IRGC's proxy model. I could have put more flags up here. These are the flags of the proxies in Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Badakor in Iraq, the Fatimiyun. These are the Shia Afghans who fought for Assad in Syria, or the Zainabiyun, they're Pakistani Shias who also fought in Syria. So Iran has created lots of these small proxies. Some of them are actually not so small, like Hezbollah is pretty big. Notice I did not put the Houthis of Yemen here. I don't think the Houthis of Yemen like to be called the proxies of Iran. They don't see themselves as a proxy of Iran. They see themselves as somebody that can cooperate with Iran when their mutual interests are served, but they don't see themselves the way Hezbollah looks at the Islamic Republic of Iran. So, again, the Iranian proxy model didn't start yesterday. It's been there from 1979, before 1979. Professor Fiedler was kind to refer to my new book, which is about Iran's Arab strategy. Iranian supporters of Khomeini, guess where they learned to shoot Kalashnikovs? They learned to shoot it in Gaddafi's Libya, in civil war Lebanon, They learned the trick of the business in camps run by Arab militants. Iran, obviously as a non-Arab country, sent a lot of these revolutionaries to the Arab world to learn the business of being revolutionaries. So Arabs were involved in 1979 revolution. There were PLO fighters in the streets of Tehran in 79. And after the revolution, the Iranians, supporters of Khomeini, returned the favor and they created the likes of Hezbollah in 82 and other groups later on in places like Iraq and so on. So my point here is that there's a long history of Iranian sponsorship to, as I put it, to create them, to arm them, to ideologically provide thought so they can operate. Two basic realities as we look forward. If the United States, if Israel, if the West in general had not created so many bad policies in the Middle East, you wouldn't have all these proxy groups. What I'm saying is Iran is good at one thing more than anything else. When there is a security vacuum, when somebody messes up, they go in and fill that vacuum. In Lebanon, prime example, there's a civil war. The Shia community in Lebanon had nobody to protect them. The Iranians went in and protected them. It was not because Iran had a great message that they loved. No, they were desperate for support and somebody to come and help them. And oftentimes when it came to particularly Shia communities, the Iranians were there to help them. But helping them today doesn't mean you control them tomorrow. And some decades later, there are questions how much Iran controls some of these groups. Because proxies are invariably, as I say, anti-state, predatory, and the question is, can Iran control them? As somebody who sits in Washington, I get calls all the time. Can Iran call the Houthis and say, stop the missiles on the ships? Nobody knows. We don't know if Iran has that. No, maybe the connection. And if there was a connection, maybe the Houthis will pick up the phone, politely say, thank you for the call, but this we have to do for us. Now, so what I'm saying is on the spectrum of proxies, Iran is much closer to some. Some of them in Iraq are entirely Iranian controlled, right? The Iranians really control everything. Some of them, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, well, Hezbollah has been around for 40-some years. It has its own independent personality now. It's a Lebanese actor in a Lebanese setup, but it's still very close to Iran. And then you have the Houthis at the other end of the spectrum, very independent. Very independent, will get missiles from Iran, but doesn't mean it would do anything or do everything Iran asks it to do. So basically what I'm saying with this slide is to give you a little bit of history, context, but also tell you that the big question going forward is, can Iran control the monster that it has created, the proxy network? Because the proxy network is, in many ways, operates like organized crime. It operates like a mafia in a state. And that's a tough challenge. Ask the Italians. How's the fight against mafia going in Italy, right? So it's not an easy challenge. So the fundamental challenge for the Iranian regime now is from Arab Spring 2011 to, you could argue, 2023, 22-23, when the Saudis signed or agreed on a ceasefire in the Yemen war. This time period, the Iranian proxy model was working. Assad won in Syria. ISIS was defeated in Iraq. The Houthis kind of defeated the Saudis. The proxy model was working. But now, going forward, can Iran control it? Let me just say this and I'll move on to the next slide. The basic idea behind the proxy model is this. Why fight your enemies in Iran when you can fight them in Lebanon or in Syria? Fight them over there. That's the better way of fighting. But what if your support for the Houthis means tomorrow the United States says, I'm not going to just hit the Houthis in Hudaydah or Sana'a. I'm going to start hitting the Revolution Guards inside of Iran. That's the big risk. That the network suddenly becomes your responsibility. They will do certain things that they will drag Iran into a war, which Iran does not want. Iran does not want to have a war with the United States. For sure, that I think we can safely say. So again, I will stop here. I won't stop here yet, but I'll just go through this slide very quickly. The Iranians are worried. For example, let me give you one example. In Syria, Syria is kind of now won by Hafez al-Assad. The Iranians can claim that they helped them stay in power. But now Syria is going to go and have economic reconstruction. There'll be projects for billions of dollars, literally hundreds of billions of dollars of economic projects. Is Iran going to get any of that? The Iranians are very nervous. They're not sure. Right now, it doesn't look good. The Turks are doing much better. Turkey's got about 38% of the Syrian market. Iran's got about 3%. So, in other words, if you're an Iranian nationalist and you want to criticize your regime's behavior in the region, you say, you're doing the fighting, but how are you actually helping the Iranian economy? How are you empowering Iranian national interest in the region? So the proxy model, as some people call, oh, it's a wonderful model, it works for the Iranians, I will just say there are a lot of questions still whether this is a long-term viable way of conducting foreign policy. So, I mean, I've always said this, Khamenei's big belief in Russia and China. And here is the historic irony of ironies. The Vladimir Putin of Christian Orthodox Russia, Communist Party President Xi, and the Shia Muslim Ali Khamenei. What ideological platform are we looking at? But there is none. It's anti-Americanism. There's one thing that keeps them together, anti-Americanism. It's not even anti-West, it's anti-Americanism. So it's not solid, it's not a strategic partnership. They help each other, yes, but don't assume that this is going to be a lasting partnership. And the West certainly has options to deal with it. One of the places they operate the best, for example, is in the media. During the pandemic, COVID pandemic, I remember you read something in Chinese media about how the Americans were responsible for COVID. Immediately, the Russians and the Iranians would say the same message. So there are operations where they cooperate against the Americans, but that doesn't mean they're in agreement in terms of what should happen in the Middle East, for example. Okay. If you're interested in terms of that rivalry between Iran, China, and the Arab countries, please let me know that during our discussions. Last slide, I promise. In summary, I just also want to say a few words about U.S. policy. In summary, U.S. policy on Iran, 44 years, 4 stages. Stage 1, 71 to 91. The United States then, in that period, wanted to have ties with Iran. Why? Because it wanted to keep the Soviet Union from getting its hands on Iran. So you have a period where the Iranians are being sought after by the Americans, but this period. Oh, where am I going? This is a cover from Time magazine. President Reagan trying to cut secret deals with the Iranians at the time. 91 to 2002. This is a period where the Cold War ends, and Iran no longer has the same geopolitical value for the United States because the Soviet Union is gone. The Americans don't really care what happens to Iran. This is the moment where Iran's position of Israel becomes the most important factor in how the Americans look at Iran. So because the United States is so pro-Israel, Iran's anti-Israel position naturally makes Iran into an adversary and opponent. If tomorrow, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei gives a message, gives a speech and says our position on Israel is going to change fundamentally, America's position on Iran will change fundamentally. It's as simple as that. Because America, for now, it might change, but right now, America is solid pro-Israel. And the Iranians are solid anti-Israel. You see the conflict, right? But nonetheless, you have the period 2002 to 2015 where the two countries are forced to negotiate, what I call tough give and take. Why? Because Iran has a nuclear program. And this nuclear program means the United States can't just ignore it anymore. It has to be involved one way or another. In the 1990s, the United States could ignore Iran. Not so much after the nuclear program has come in. So, two issues really dominate this period. It's Iran's nuclear program and Iran's regional activities. Remember, the period 2002 to 2015 is where the United States is in Afghanistan. It's in Iraq. 100,000 plus American troops are in the region, and the Iranians are undermining the United States through their proxy network. So the United States needs to deal with Iran on different levels, on a strategic nuclear level and on a lesser level in terms of Iranian actions in the region. This is also the period where Iran and the United States signed their nuclear deal, July of 2015, and this was hardly friendship, but they avoided a war. And then obviously 2018 and onwards, you got maximum pressure of Donald Trump, who might very well become the next president by January of next year. Next year, this time, you might have another President Trump in the White House. His maximum pressure campaign, I mean, I could go on, but let me say this. The problem with Trump's maximum pressure campaign on Iran was he told the Iranians, all I will do to you is economic sanctions. But he said from the get-go, I won't go to war with you. And as soon as the Iranian leaders heard that, they said, okay, sanctions we can deal with. If you had said you go to war with us, you get our attention. But you're saying you don't want to go to war with us, so that's fine. That's where we are right now. People tried, people like Secretary of State Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, others tried to push Trump in the direction of war with Iran, but Trump didn't want to do it because Trump is a populist. And in America, a new war in the Middle East has no support, very little support. And Trump just wants to be loved by his supporters. So when he heard the voters don't want to go to war in the Middle East, he basically said to his team, I'm not going to go to war. He did certain things. He assassinated Qasem Soleimani in January 2020 and so on. But again, the day after, he came out and said, no war. We killed him, but no war. Because again, wars are in the Middle East are not popular. So, last slide, I think. How many times have I said that? I'm not very good with numbers. So where we are right now is this no war, no deal. It works for U.S. and Iran. Khamenei does not want to open up to the United States because he thinks the United States wants regime change. And he knows having relations with the U.S. is good for Iran, but he also knows it's not good for him. And he cares for himself more than the Iranian national interest. The Biden administration has no Iran policy. It's day by day by day by day. What crisis? Let's solve the crisis, move on. There is no strategy, right? There is no strategy that says 5 years, 10 years, this is all to be our policy. The Russians have a long-term strategy for Iran. You know what that is? Keep the Americans out. The Chinese have a strategy for Iran. You know what that is? Keep the Americans out. Russia and China will not want to see that American embassy open up into Iran. They will do anything to prevent it, I think. But that's just my guess. So you have two countries at the end of this fight, Tehran and Washington, with no strategic game plan. And Iran instead joins things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this new BRICS bloc of countries. There's de-escalation with Arab countries like Saudi Arabia. So Iran feels like it can have this enmity with the United States and get away with it, right? In the 1990s, Iran felt it needed to talk to Washington. Today, Iran doesn't seem to feel that way. Although that could change if the Americans start turning the heat back on Iran. So, in 2024, expect the continuation of small steps to prevent war escalation, but don't expect major changes in this U.S.-Iran tango, this awkward dance that they engage in. So, let me stop here, and then I very much look forward to your comments, questions, and I have pretty thick skin, so you can attack anything you didn't like, or criticize anything you felt was perhaps wrong or not the way you see things. So, thank you.